A 17-year-old black girl in a school uniform walked into Boston's most elite luxury car showroom and was immediately judged, dismissed, and humiliated. What no one knew was that she was about to buy a $600,000 Lamborghini for her billionaire father's birthday, and that mistake would cost them dearly. It was a bright, crisp morning in Boston. Newbury Street shimmered in the early sunlight, lined with boutique storefronts, high-end cafes, and luxury car dealerships that catered to the city's wealthiest clientele. Among them stood Hamilton Prestige Motors, a glass and steel fortress of opulence, where names like Ferrari, Rolls-Royce, and Bentley weren't just brands but badges of status. Inside, the air was scented with leather, espresso, and quiet exclusivity. Gleaming under showroom lights was the crown jewel, a Lamborghini Aventador SVJ Roadster, blazing red and polished to perfection. Its price tag, just under $600,000. Everything about this place whispered wealth. The music was soft, classical. The staff wore tailored suits. Every smile was calculated, every nod rehearsed. Then the glass door slid open. She walked in slowly, her steps light but purposeful. Jasmine Carter, 17, African American. Her natural curls framed her face, and her brown eyes scanned the room with quiet curiosity. She wore her private school uniform, pressed but plain. Her sneakers were worn, her backpack faded. She carried no designer handbag, wore no flashy jewelry, but her posture was straight and her gaze was steady. From the moment she entered, the energy in the room shifted. The salesman, mid-conversation, paused. One associate leaned closer to another, whispering something with a smirk. A couple of clients turned their heads, their expressions a mixture of surprise and subtle disdain. To them, she didn't belong. Blake Anderson, the showroom's senior sales manager, was the first to act. Mid-40s, white, with perfectly slick-back hair and a permanent air of condescension, he prided himself on knowing which customers were serious before they even spoke. Jasmine didn't fit the mold. Not her clothes, not her age, and certainly not her skin. With a rehearsed smile and narrowed eyes, Blake approached her. "Good morning," he said, voice smooth but distant. "Are you lost, sweetheart? This isn't really the kind of place for browsing." Jasmine blinked, slightly taken aback. "No, sir. I'm interested in the Lamborghini." The Aventador SVJ. Blake raised an eyebrow, amused. "You do realize," he said slowly, "that car starts at around $600,000, plus taxes and customization fees. Most people just want a picture with it." Jasmine held his gaze. "I'm not most people." Her voice was calm, composed, but Blake wasn't convinced. He chuckled softly, waving a hand toward the door. "Well, unless you've got that kind of money on you today, I suggest checking out something a little more realistic. Maybe a used Audi or something in that range." Behind him, a few staff members stifled laughter. A man in a navy suit watched with curiosity, sipping his espresso. The tension in the room tightened, invisible but sharp. Jasmine's face flushed, not with shame, but with the sting of being written off, again. Judged by the color of her skin, her age, her shoes. But she didn't argue. She didn't offer a name or status. She simply nodded, her chin held high, and walked back toward the door. She didn't look back, because she already knew what they didn't. She wasn't there to dream. She was there to buy. That Lamborghini, the one they thought she couldn't even afford to touch, was meant to be a gift. A 50th birthday surprise for her father, David Carter, a tech visionary, a self-made billionaire. A black man who'd faced a lifetime of discrimination and still built one of the most powerful renewable energy companies in the country. But Jasmine didn't use her last name when she walked in. Her father had taught her better. taught her that people show you who they really are when they don't think you matter. And Blake Anderson had just shown her everything she needed to see. What he didn't know was that the next morning, a custom black Rolls-Royce Phantom would pull up outside Hamilton Prestige Motors, and the man stepping out of it would make sure Blake and everyone else in that showroom remembered that moment for the rest of their lives. Jasmine Carter walked out of the glass doors of Hamilton Prestige Motors with her head high, but inside a storm brewed quietly. The sound of laughter still echoed faintly in her ears, those snide chuckles from the salesman, the subtle judgment from the onlookers, the dismissive tone of Blake Anderson. It was a scene she had lived through before, just never quite like this. The morning air was crisp, yet it didn't soothe her. As she stepped down the front steps, she could feel the invisible weight of every condescending glance pressing on her back. Her sneakers, scuffed and silent, carried her across the smooth pavement, back to her modest sedan parked a block away. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply sat behind the steering wheel, closed her eyes and breathed in deeply, slowly. Because Jasmine understood something that Blake Anderson never would. True dignity doesn't always need a voice. It doesn't need to shout or demand respect in the moment. Sometimes dignity is quiet. It's in the way you choose to walk away instead of stooping down to someone else's level. It's in the strength to endure disrespect without letting it define you. And for Jasmine, that silent strength had been passed down to her through stories, through struggle, through the lessons of a father who had once walked out of far harsher rooms. As she drove away, the Lamborghini faded from her rearview mirror, but not from her mind. That car wasn't about luxury to her. It wasn't some symbol of wealth or power. It was about honoring the man who had given her everything without asking for anything in return. Her father, David Carter, had never been one to flaunt his success. Despite building a billion-dollar tech empire, he still wore the same watch from college and drove a 6-year-old hybrid SUV. To him, character was measured not in net worth, but in how you treated the janitor the same way you treated the CEO. Jasmine had grown up in a home where humility was a principle, not a performance. Her father had taught her that silence wasn't weakness, it was control. And sometimes the loudest messages delivered without a single word. Still, even with all that wisdom, the sting lingered. She thought about the way Blake had looked at her, like she was some child lost in a world she couldn't possibly afford to touch. The way he had waved her off like an inconvenience, a distraction from his real customers. The way no one, not a single person, had stepped in. She had felt like a ghost in a room full of glass and chrome, and yet she hadn't broken. Back at home, the Carter estate stood quietly behind ivy-covered walls and wrought iron gates. It wasn't ostentatious, but it was grand in its own right. Elegant, spacious, filled with warmth instead of marble. Jasmine parked in the side drive and made her way inside. Her father was in the den, reading a worn hardcover, his reading glasses slipping slightly down the bridge of his nose. When he saw her, he smiled, until he noticed her eyes. "Jazz?" he asked, setting the book aside. "What happened?" She didn't answer right away. She stood in the doorway, backpack still on her shoulder, trying to hold herself together. But when she opened her mouth to speak, the words crumbled into quiet sobs. Her father didn't rush her. He simply stood, walked to her, and pulled her into his arms. It was there in the stillness of his embrace that Jasmine told him everything. The way Blake had approached her, the way he mocked her interest in the Lamborghini, the way everyone else silently allowed it, and the way she had chosen to walk away because she knew she didn't know anyone proof of who she was. David Carter listened carefully. His jaw tightened slightly at the mention of Blake's name, but his eyes remained calm. When Jasmine finished, she looked up, searching his face for some kind of reaction. Anger, perhaps. Instead, she saw something steadier. Pride. "Sweetheart," he said softly, "you did exactly what I hoped you'd do." Jasmine blinked. "What do you mean?" "You walked in there not as my daughter," he said, "but as your own person. And when they tried to diminish you, you didn't stoop to their level. You didn't throw a name or a number in their face. You let them show who they were." He guided her to the leather sofa, and they sat side by side. The morning sun cast long shadows through the floor-to-ceiling windows. "I've been in rooms like that my whole life," he said, "and every time I had a choice, fight small battles with small men, or rise above them and wait for the moment to make them listen." Jasmine exhaled slowly. "It still hurt." "I know it did," he replied, "and it should. That means your heart's still alive. But tomorrow we respond. Not with anger, but with truth." He reached over and opened a leather binder on the coffee table. Inside was the order confirmation she had prepared weeks earlier. The deposit had already been wired. The specs chosen. It had all been ready. She just wanted to finalize the details in person. "Tomorrow," David said, "we show up. Together." Jasmine nodded. Her tears had dried, but something new had taken their place. A fire. A quiet fire. Because some lessons are taught through humiliation, but others, they are taught through dignity and silence, and the thunder that follows. The next morning, the atmosphere at Hamilton Prestige Motors was just as polished and self-assured as ever. The sun gleamed against the floor-to-ceiling windows, reflecting off the showroom's spotless tile floor and bouncing off the bodies of high-end sports cars that seemed too perfect to touch. Blake Anderson, in his tailored navy suit and polished loafers, stood at the espresso machine near the front desk, stirring in a little sugar and admiring himself in the chrome finish. He was still riding the quiet satisfaction of yesterday's encounter. To him, putting a presumptuous teenager in her place was just another part of maintaining the brand's image. This dealership wasn't a playground. It was an ecosystem built for the rich, the important, and the exceptional. And Jasmine Carter? Just another name he didn't bother to remember. He sipped his coffee with smug contentment. Then came the sound. At first it was distant, a low, slow rumble that didn't quite belong in the predictable background hum of the city. Blake barely glanced up, expecting a standard delivery truck or maybe a passing engine rev. But then it grew deeper, louder, more refined. Every gear shift was smooth and deliberate. It was the kind of sound that made car enthusiasts pause and pay attention. And so they did. Every head in the showroom turned. A black Rolls-Royce Phantom glided into view, its finish sleek as obsidian, sunlight slipping off its curves like water. The driver parked directly in front of the main entrance. There was no rush, no chaos, just undeniable presence. Blake straightened his jacket instinctively. From his office at the back, Richard Mason, the dealership's owner, emerged with heightened curiosity. He'd heard the engine too, and now walked quickly toward the front, adjusting his cufflinks. Richard was a man who understood importance when he saw it, and this car screamed high-level client. The rear door of the Rolls-Royce opened with a smooth mechanical sigh. Out stepped a man in a charcoal gray suit, every detail immaculate, from the subtle silver cufflinks to the polished black Oxfords. He moved with quiet confidence, the kind not built on performance, but experience. His posture was upright, his eyes sharp, and his expression unreadable. Blake took a step forward, his tone instantly shifting into salesman mode. "Good morning, sir. Welcome to Hamilton Prestige Motors," he said with rehearsed warmth. "I'm Blake Anderson, Senior Sales Manager, and this is Mr. Mason, our dealership's owner. It's an honor to have you with us today." The man didn't respond at first. He simply looked through the glass, scanning the showroom calmly before turning to face them. "My name," he said evenly, "is David Carter." For a moment there was silence. Not dramatic, not explosive, just the kind of stillness that made time feel slower. Blake's smile faltered. The name hit him like a brick. Carter. His mind scrambled. The girl, the school uniform, the Lamborghini. Her last name had never come up. He never asked, because he had never thought she deserved the question. Next to him, Richard blinked, his brow furrowing, and then realization slowly dawned on his face. David Carter, the billionaire tech magnate, chief executive officer of an international renewable energy firm, a quiet but powerful figure who rarely made public appearances, but when he did, people noticed. Blake swallowed hard. "Well, Mr. Carter," he said, trying to recover, "it's truly a pleasure. What brings you to our dealership today?" David's eyes met Blake's, and something cold and measured passed between them. No anger, just clarity. "I'm here because my daughter came in yesterday." Richard's eyes darted toward Blake. Blake froze. David continued. "She came to finalize a vehicle purchase, a Lamborghini Aventador SVJ Roadster. But instead of being treated like a customer, she was humiliated, mocked, and dismissed. A few other employees nearby stopped what they were doing. You could have heard a pin drop." Blake forced a laugh, strained and paper-thin. "Ah, yes, there must have been some confusion. We see a lot of visitors and—" "There was no confusion," David interrupted calmly. "She came in with a purpose, and you saw nothing but a school uniform and dark skin. You didn't ask her name. You didn't offer help. You made assumptions. And now here we are." Richard stepped in, his voice apologetic. "Mr. Carter, I deeply regret—" "I'm not here for apologies," David cut in smoothly. "I'm here for clarity and accountability." Blake's face turned pale. The weight of the moment finally settled in. David walked slowly into the showroom. Each step echoed softly on the tile, dignified and deliberate. Employees cleared a path without being asked. He stopped directly in front of the red Aventador SVJ Roadster. "This," he said quietly, "is the car my daughter chose. She saved for months, researched every detail. It was meant to be a gift. For me." Blake stood frozen, shame burning beneath his expensive suit. David turned back toward him. "And because of your arrogance, she walked out of here feeling small, invisible. That ends today." Then his tone softened, but only slightly. "There's someone else I'd like to speak with," he added. "Where is Daniel Miller?" Blake blinked in surprise. Daniel, a younger associate, barely in his 20s, stepped forward from the far side of the showroom. He'd been watching the entire exchange, his expression tight with a mix of guilt and silent hope. David gave him a nod of respect. "You," he said, "are the only one who treated my daughter with dignity. She told me everything. From now on, you'll be handling this transaction." Blake looked as if he'd just been punched in the gut. Richard Mason tried to regain footing. "Of course, Mr. Carter. Daniel will take care of it. And again, we are deeply sorry." David didn't wait for him to finish. He extended a firm handshake to Daniel, who accepted it with visible humility. Then, as calmly as he arrived, David Carter walked toward the office to finalize the deal, with the very employee who had simply done the right thing. And behind him, Blake stood still, facing the harshest reflection of all. Not a mirror, but the consequences of prejudice in a place built on prestige. David Carter didn't come to Hamilton Prestige Motors for a simple apology. And by the time the paperwork for the Lamborghini was completed, that fact became crystal clear. As Daniel Miller wrapped up the transaction with precision and professionalism, Blake Anderson stood to the side like a man displaced in his own kingdom. His usual confidence had all but vanished, replaced by a growing storm of regret, confusion, and something unfamiliar: fear. David thanked Daniel calmly and took one final glance around the showroom. The Lamborghini, now officially under his name, gleamed beneath the lights, but he wasn't admiring the car. He was measuring the moment. Turning toward Richard Mason, the dealership's owner, David's voice was calm but absolute. "I'd like a word with you. Privately." Richard nodded, already on edge. They moved into the dealership's executive office, the frosted glass door shutting behind them. Blake stood outside, unable to hear what was said, but knowing, deep down, that this wasn't going to end with a handshake. Inside, David didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Mr. Mason," he began, "what happened yesterday goes far beyond poor customer service. It was discrimination, clear, sharp, and damaging. My daughter was treated with contempt not because she was impolite or disruptive, but because of how she looked." Richard's shoulders tightened. "Mr. Carter, I agree. And believe me when I say we take this seriously." "No," David interrupted, his gaze unwavering. "You don't. Because if you had taken it seriously, it wouldn't have happened in the first place." He let the words settle like dust on polished hardwood. "You run a business that thrives on image," David continued. "But when your image is built on prejudice, it's only a matter of time before the cracks show. Yesterday, those cracks became a chasm." Richard shifted in his chair, uneasy. "So, what do you want from us?" David leaned forward slightly. "Change, real change. Not just a press release, not just a shallow apology." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a printed packet. "This is a partnership proposal with the Carter Foundation," he said, placing the folder on the table. "If you want to begin repairing the damage that's been done, not just to my daughter, but to the reputation of this dealership, you'll agree to every term outlined here." Richard picked up the folder, flipping through pages filled with commitments. Mandatory racial bias training for all employees, a revised hiring process to ensure diversity in leadership roles, a new community outreach program aimed at providing internships for underprivileged students, and, most notably, required volunteer hours for key staff at the Carter Foundation's Youth Center. He looked up, stunned. "You want my sales team to volunteer?" "I want them to see what it's like outside of these glass walls," David replied. "To sit with children who get judged every day for things they can't control. I want them to understand the damage that quiet prejudice causes. So maybe next time, they'll think twice before assuming who belongs where." Richard exhaled, defeated but nodding. "And Blake?" David's expression didn't change. "He doesn't deserve to be fired," he said. "Not yet. He deserves to learn. If he refuses to grow, then yes, you'll know what to do. But this isn't about revenge, Mr. Mason. This is about education." He stood, adjusting his cufflinks. "Make no mistake," he said, voice cool but resolute. "Your dealership isn't just losing a major client today. You're being given a chance to rebuild trust, one that most businesses never get." Richard rose from his chair. "You have my word, Mr. Carter." David offered a firm handshake. "Let's hope your actions match it." Outside the office, the staff pretended to look busy, but all eyes followed the two men as they emerged. Blake took an instinctive step forward. "Mr. Carter," he began, voice low, "I just want to say—" David raised a hand, not unkindly, but with a tone of finality. "Mr. Anderson, there will come a time when an apology is the right thing to offer. But that time is after you've taken accountability, not before. Words are cheap. Actions prove who you really are." Blake nodded, swallowing his pride. "Understood, sir." David gave one last glance at the Lamborghini, now sealed in a contract Daniel had completed with care and dignity, before walking toward the entrance. As the Rolls-Royce Phantom pulled away from the curb, an unspoken truth lingered in the air, like the soft scent of engine oil and leather. What happened inside that dealership would not be remembered for the car that was bought, but for the mirror it held up to everyone in that room. In the days that followed, changes began to roll out. Richard Mason personally called the Carter Foundation to arrange meetings. Training consultants were scheduled. Brochures about bias awareness replaced flashy sales awards on the breakroom bulletin board. Blake Anderson, once the face of sales at Hamilton Prestige, was now just another employee, no longer above the lesson he had helped spark. He spent the following week working at the Carter Foundation, organizing books for kids who didn't care that he once sold six-figure vehicles. On his third day, a little girl with skin the color of his shame looked up at him and asked, "Do you treat people nicer now?" Blake had no rehearsed answer, just a pause. Then quietly, "I'm trying." Because that's what David Carter wanted most. Not punishment, but progress. And progress, he knew, always begins with the courage to face the consequences beyond an apology. Blake Anderson had always believed in control. He controlled the tone of conversations, the rhythm of negotiations, and the atmosphere of the showroom. In his world, power came from presence, the tailored suits, the polished shoes, the confident smile. For years, that persona had served him well. He was the authority at Hamilton Prestige Motors, the man customers turned to for high-end deals and status-driven validation. But now everything felt different. Just days after David Carter's visit and the unexpected reckoning that followed, Blake found himself standing at the entrance of the Carter Foundation Youth Center, clutching a clipboard like a stranger on his first day of school. Gone was the comfort of Italian leather chairs and the shine of Lamborghinis. In its place were chipped tiles, colorful posters about kindness, and a chorus of laughter from children who couldn't care less about brand names. He was scheduled for 2 weeks of volunteer work, non-negotiable, not just community service, but a condition laid out by David Carter himself. And Richard Mason had made it clear, refusal wasn't an option. "This is your chance," Richard had said, "not just to save your job, but to prove you understand why it nearly slipped away." Blake didn't respond that day. He had nothing to say. Now here he was, assigned to help tutor children, serve meals, and clean common areas. It was a far cry from selling six-figure supercars, but it was also the first time in years anyone had looked at him without trying to impress him. He wasn't Mr. Anderson here. He was just Blake. And at first he hated every second of it. The children were noisy, the furniture was old, the work was humbling. On his second day, he was asked to mop the floors after snack time, and he nearly refused, until he remembered David Carter's warning. Words are cheap. Actions prove who you really are. He gritted his teeth and mopped. By the fourth day, something unexpected happened. A boy named Thomas, no older than 9, came up to him with a wide, toothy smile and a tattered backpack hanging from one shoulder. "Mr. Blake, want to see what I drew today?" Blake looked down, surprised. Sure." Thomas opened a sketchbook filled with colorful, messy crayon drawings. In one picture, there was a man in a suit giving a little girl a car. "That's me and my sister," Thomas said proudly. "One day, I'm going to buy her a car like the one you sell." Blake stared at the drawing. Something shifted. "You know," he said slowly, "those cars cost a lot of money." Thomas nodded. "Yeah, I know, but my mom says I can be anything, even if I don't look like I belong in those places." The words struck Blake like a punch to the gut. He had used that exact phrase, "don't belong," not long ago. Only this time it had come from a child who had likely heard it one too many times already. That night, Blake sat in his apartment, staring at the city lights through his window, and for the first time, he truly reflected on what he had done. Not just to Jasmine Carter, but to every person he had judged silently, every client he had ignored because they didn't look the part, every moment he had wielded power like a weapon instead of a responsibility. He remembered his younger self, broke, hungry, desperate to be taken seriously in the luxury car industry. How quickly he had forgotten that version of himself. He pulled out his phone and hesitated, Then he typed, "Jasmine, I don't expect a response, but I want you to know, I see it now. I was wrong, deeply, and I'm sorry, truly. Thank you for showing me who I really was and who I still have the chance to become." He didn't hit send immediately. His thumb hovered over the button for a long time before finally pressing it. Then he set the phone down and stared into the dark. The next day, something changed. He greeted the children more naturally. He remembered their names. He helped Thomas fix the strap on his backpack. He even offered to read a story aloud to the group, a task he would have laughed off just a week ago. At Hamilton Prestige Motors, word of Blake's transformation began to spread. Daniel Miller, now a rising star at the dealership, mentioned to Richard that Blake had become a completely different man. "He listens more," Daniel said. "He asks questions, and he doesn't try to dominate every interaction." Richard raised an eyebrow. "We'll see how long it lasts." But in truth, even Richard was starting to feel it. By the end of Blake's second week at the Carter Foundation, he didn't want to leave. Not because the work was easy, but because it felt real. One afternoon, while helping a group of kids organize books, Thomas looked up at him and said, "I hope you stay, Mr. Blake. You're nicer than you look." Blake chuckled softly, touched in a way he hadn't expected. "I'll try, Thomas. I'll really try." Because that's what this journey had become. Not about redemption, not about repairing an image, but about rebuilding character, one honest action at a time. Blake Anderson would never be the same again, and for once, that was a good thing. A week after completing his final volunteer shift at the Carter Foundation, Blake Anderson stood outside the grand ballroom of the Bostonian Hotel, hands sweating slightly despite the perfectly controlled air conditioning. The gala was already in full swing, a formal charity event hosted by the Carter Foundation to raise funds for disadvantaged youth, and now, thanks to recent events, also a symbol of transformation and accountability. Inside, the room sparkled with elegance. Crystal chandeliers, polished marble floors, and guests in tuxedos and evening gowns, mingling with champagne flutes and quiet grace. The air hummed with money and status. But this time, Blake wasn't here to impress anyone. He was here for something much more difficult. He adjusted his black tie, drew in a slow breath, and stepped through the doors. The moment he entered, heads turned. Some recognized him, a few nodded, others looked away. But Blake wasn't focused on the crowd. He was looking for one person, and there she was, Jasmine Carter, standing near the center of the room, dressed in a simple but elegant blue gown. Her hair fell gently over her shoulders, and her eyes scanned the room with calm awareness. She spoke with a group of guests politely, but there was a quiet distance in her expression, the kind that comes from remembering exactly who once tried to diminish you. Blake moved toward her, every step heavy with the weight of what he had come to do. He waited for a moment when she was alone, then gently approached. "Miss Carter," he said softly, his voice free of the arrogance it once carried. "Do you have a moment?" She turned, and for a second, her expression tensed, but only briefly. She nodded once. "Mr. Anderson," he nodded in return. "Thank you for speaking with me. I won't take much of your time. I came to say something I should have said a long time ago." She didn't say a word, just waited. Blake took a breath. "What I said to you, what I assumed about you, it wasn't just unprofessional, it was deeply wrong. I judged you based on nothing but appearances. I treated you with condescension, with prejudice, and I humiliated someone who didn't deserve any of that." His voice wavered slightly. "You stood there with more grace than I've ever seen. You didn't lash out. You didn't try to prove who you were. You let me expose my ignorance all on my own." Jasmine's expression remained composed. She listened, but her face revealed little. Blake continued, "I thought the worst thing I lost that day was a sale. But I realize now, I lost something far more important, my integrity and your respect." There was a long pause between them. The gala music played softly in the background, but for Blake, the entire room had fallen silent. Finally, Jasmine spoke. Her voice was measured but sincere. "Do you know how many times I've been treated like I didn't belong somewhere?" she asked quietly. "Do you know how often people assume I'm just another girl with nothing to offer?" Blake lowered his eyes. "I can imagine, and I hate that I became part of that." "I didn't need you to validate me," she said, "but I did deserve respect. Everyone does." "I know that now," Blake replied, looking her in the eye. "And I'm not just here to apologize with words. I've started making changes. At the dealership, at the foundation, in myself. I still have a long way to go, but I wanted you to hear it from me." Jasmine studied him. Then slowly she nodded. "I appreciate that you came here to say this in person," she said. "And I believe people can change, if they choose to." Blake felt a weight lift slightly from his shoulders. "I have a lot more to prove," he admitted, "but I won't stop trying." Just then, from across the ballroom, David Carter watched the exchange with quiet satisfaction. He turned back to his conversation, saying nothing. But he didn't need to. He had seen what he came to see. Later that evening, as the auction began and guests raised paddles to bid on luxury items and exclusive experiences, Blake stood near the back of the room. He no longer felt like he was putting on a performance. He wasn't trying to reclaim old glory or polish a damaged image. He was there as a man who had made a mistake and who was working day by day to make it right. Toward the end of the night, Jasmine approached him one last time. She held out a folded card, an invitation. "We're hosting a youth mentorship event next month," she said. "I think you'd be a good person to talk about second chances." Blake took the card, his voice low. "I'd be honored. Because redemption isn't about perfection. It's about accountability. It's about showing up when it's uncomfortable. And it's about proving through actions, not promises, that you are no longer the person who caused the harm." For Blake Anderson, that journey had only just begun. But for the first time in his life, he was on the right road. In the days following the Carter Foundation Gala, word of what had transpired inside Hamilton Prestige Motors began to spread far beyond Boston. At first, it was just quiet murmurs. People in the luxury automotive world exchanging stories over coffee, speculating whether the rumors were true. But it didn't stay quiet for long. A well-known business journalist who attended the gala published a reflective op-ed in the Boston Globe titled "Dignity Denied: How a Teen Girl Exposed the Ugly Face Behind Prestige." The article detailed Jasmine Carter's experience, without sensationalism, but with piercing clarity. It highlighted the discrimination she endured, the grace she maintained, and the accountability her father demanded, not with lawsuits or outrage, but with action and consequences. The piece quickly went viral. By the end of the week, it had been picked up by national outlets: Forbes, CNN Business, the New York Times. Social media lit up with hashtags like #Respect Beyond Appearance and #Jasmine Carter Story. Influencers and CEOs alike began weighing in, some praising the Carters for their dignified approach, others calling for greater reforms across luxury-facing industries that often thrive on quiet bias and coded discrimination. But at the center of the storm sat Hamilton Prestige Motors. Internally, the dealership was unraveling. Richard Mason, the longtime owner, was flooded with interview requests, corporate inquiries, and messages from loyal customers now questioning whether they still wanted to be associated with the brand. A longtime partner from a high-end European manufacturer discreetly postponed an upcoming vehicle launch event scheduled at the dealership. Worse yet, several of the dealership's top clients, people who had spent millions over the years, began pulling out of future deals. Not because of the car, because of the culture. They didn't want their names tied to an organization that had been publicly exposed for treating a black teenager like she was invisible. Richard knew the numbers better than anyone, and he knew what this meant. It wasn't just a PR headache. It was a reputation crisis with long-term implications. Losing David Carter's business was painful, but losing the trust of the broader community? That was fatal. In an emergency board meeting, Richard laid it all out. "We can't pretend this will pass in a news cycle," he said to his executive team. "We've been exposed, and not just for one bad incident, for a culture that tolerated silence, subtle prejudice, and gatekeeping. That ends now." The decision was unanimous. Hamilton Prestige Motors would undergo a full internal audit of its hiring, training, and customer service policies. A third-party diversity consultant was brought in. All employees, from sales reps to service advisors, were required to participate in an 8-week cultural sensitivity and equity training course. Even Richard himself enrolled in a leadership accountability program, but none of it could be done quietly. Richard knew that real trust could only begin to rebuild through transparency. So the dealership did what few businesses in their position ever dared to do. They went public. A full-page letter, signed by Richard Mason, appeared in the Boston Globe and Automotive Weekly. "To our customers and community, we failed. Not only did we fail Jasmine Carter and her family, we failed every customer who ever walked into our showroom and felt unseen. We tolerated a culture that rewarded surface-level judgment over substance, image over integrity, and now we're paying the price. We are not asking for forgiveness. We are asking for the chance to prove, through transparency, through reform, and through measurable action, that we can be better." This is not a PR response. This is a promise. Richard Mason, owner, Hamilton Prestige Motors. The letter received mixed reactions. Some praised it as brave and necessary. Others dismissed it as too little, too late. But one thing was clear: the dealership had hit a turning point. Meanwhile, Blake Anderson returned to work, not in his former title, but in a new role created specifically by the Carter Foundation's recommendations: Director of Customer Equity and Experience, a title that came with no prestige and no staff beneath him, but one that required him to lead by example. Every day, Blake met with employees, not to talk about quotas or upsells, but to listen, to field complaints, to acknowledge harm. He helped rewrite the company's onboarding manual. He created a mentorship program for young interns from underserved communities. And he made sure that new hires weren't just taught how to close a sale, but how to see people. It wasn't glamorous, but it was necessary. On the sales floor, things looked different too. Daniel Miller, now one of the top-performing associates in the company, was mentoring younger staff. The energy had shifted. Customers of all backgrounds walked in and felt something unfamiliar. Welcome. And Jasmine Carter? She didn't need to say a word. Her presence alone had been powerful enough to change a room, a company, and now maybe even an industry. Months later, at an automotive leadership summit in Chicago, a panel discussion was held on ethics in luxury sales. Blake was invited as a guest speaker, not to boast, but to share a cautionary tale. He stood before the crowd, paused, and said, "I'm not here today because I did everything right. I'm here because I got it wrong," and was given the gift of being held accountable. Jasmine Carter changed how I see the world, and I hope our story changes how you run your businesses. That moment didn't erase his mistakes, but it proved one thing clearly. Public accountability doesn't destroy a business. It saves its soul. Months had passed since the incident at Hamilton Prestige Motors, but the ripples it caused hadn't faded. They had grown, deepening into the roots of something more lasting. What started as a humiliating moment for a young black girl had transformed into a movement inside one of Boston's most exclusive luxury car dealerships. And at the center of it was a truth many had once ignored. Real change doesn't come from fear of being exposed. It comes from a commitment to being better when no one's watching. Inside the newly redesigned dealership, the changes weren't just cosmetic. Yes, the showroom still gleamed with Italian leather, polished chrome, and six-figure vehicles, but the energy in the space was different, more human, more inclusive. The walls now featured artwork from local youth, many from the Carter Foundation, replacing the sterile minimalist decor once designed to impress the elite. A large frame poster near the front door read, "Character isn't sold, it's shown." Every employee who stepped onto the floor had been through intensive training, not the usual corporate video modules, but real facilitated workshops that addressed unconscious bias, racial equity, and what it means to serve people beyond the surface. Former clients who once felt out of place now spoke up, saying how welcome they felt for the first time. A mother in a modest dress browsing SUVs with her teenage son no longer drew suspicious glances, but offers of coffee and thoughtful conversation. Blake Anderson had become a different man. He didn't return to his old title of senior sales manager. He didn't want to. Instead, he'd chosen to lead a new initiative focused on community partnerships and customer experience. Every Thursday, he met with interns from underrepresented neighborhoods, helping them understand not just how to sell cars, but how to walk into spaces that were never designed for them and make their voices heard. One afternoon, as he led a group of teens through the showroom, he stopped in front of the red Lamborghini Aventador SVJ Roadster, now affectionately referred to by staff as Jasmine's car. "This," Blake said, resting his hand gently on the hood, "was the car that started it all. But it wasn't about horsepower or price. It was about perception and how wrong ours was." One student, a tall, quiet boy named Darren, raised his hand. "Mr. Anderson, what made you change? Like, for real?" Blake smiled, not the polished kind he used to flash, but something more sincere. "I stopped trying to protect my pride," he said, "and I started listening to the people I used to overlook." He didn't go into all the details, how he'd broken down the night after David Carter's visit, or how he'd sat in silence at the youth center, ashamed of his reflection. But he did share what mattered. "That moment forced me to see the gap between who I thought I was and who I really was," he continued. "And you can't unsee that, not if you care." Across town, Jasmine Carter was forging her own path. Now 18, she had just finished her first semester at Harvard, studying sociology and business ethics, driven not by revenge, but by a desire to redesign the systems that once tried to box her in. Her story had become the subject of case studies, campus talks, and panels on equity in service industries. She didn't chase attention, but it found her nonetheless. Despite the attention, Jasmine remained grounded. She still walked the halls of the Carter Foundation, still helped organize weekend reading sessions for younger kids, and still kept in touch with Daniel Miller, who, thanks to her, had become the dealership's top executive in charge of mentorship and development. One Saturday morning, Jasmine returned to Hamilton Prestige, not for a car, but for a quiet visit. She walked through the front door wearing jeans and a simple sweater, and no one stared. No one hesitated. A receptionist smiled and said, "Good morning, Mrs. Carter. Welcome back." Blake, hearing her name, stepped out from a nearby hallway. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. "No clipboard this time," she said with a slight grin. "No assumptions this time," he replied. They both laughed. The weight of the past momentarily lifted. "I'm glad you came," Blake said. "I wanted you to see what you helped to create." Jasmine looked around. She could feel it. The shift wasn't just for show. "I didn't do it," she said quietly. "You chose to change. That's the difference." Blake nodded. "Maybe, but your silence that day, that was louder than anything I'd ever heard. It changed the whole room. Later that afternoon, a group of new interns gathered for a mentorship session in the community room. Jasmine joined as a surprise guest, sitting casually among them. One girl asked, "Didn't you feel powerless that day? Like they had all the control?" Jasmine smiled. "Power isn't always loud," she said. "Sometimes it's just knowing exactly who you are, even when others don't." Back at the dealership, Richard Mason looked over the quarterly report. Sales had dipped during the public fallout, but they had steadily recovered. What surprised him most, however, was the increase in returning customers, particularly those from communities the dealership once ignored. The trust was growing, slowly but surely. He walked over to Blake's office, leaned in the doorway, and said, "You know, the place feels different." Blake looked up from his desk. "Better?" "Much better," Richard said. "For the first time, it feels honest." And maybe that's what true change looks like. Not a headline, not a speech, but the steady, uncomfortable, beautiful work of unlearning, listening, and choosing every day to do better than the day before. Because true change doesn't start when you're caught. It starts when you care enough to keep going after the spotlight fades. In the end, it wasn't the Lamborghini that made headlines. It wasn't the showroom, the suit, or the prestige that lingered in people's memories. It was a moment, quiet, sharp, unforgettable, when a young black girl walked into a world that wasn't built for her and stood tall anyway. Jasmine Carter never raised her voice. She never flaunted her wealth or demanded respect. She didn't need to. Her presence, her poise, and her unwavering dignity did what no confrontation ever could. It held up a mirror to a system that prided itself on luxury, but quietly practiced exclusion. Her story didn't just change a dealership, it changed a mindset. It taught us that true strength is silent, but unmistakable. That sometimes the most powerful act of resistance is simply choosing to stay composed when the world expects you to crumble. Blake Anderson, once the gatekeeper of prestige, learned that lesson the hard way, through discomfort, through humility, through listening. But in doing so, he discovered something far more valuable than a title or a commission. He found the courage to change, and that change, real, visible, lasting, was never about punishment. It was about accountability, growth, and the power of second chances when they're truly earned. Jasmine never sought revenge. Her father, David Carter, never asked for special treatment. What they demanded, quietly, firmly, was respect, equality, humanity, and that demand rippled far beyond the walls of Hamilton Prestige Motors. Because the truth is, we all walk into rooms where someone has already made up their mind about us. Rooms where appearance speaks louder than character, where prejudice hides behind politeness. But what Jasmine Carter showed the world is that you are never defined by those rooms. You define them with your presence, your dignity, your refusal to shrink. So to anyone who's ever been underestimated, dismissed, or judged before they spoke a single word, this story is yours. And to those with the power to welcome, to include, and to choose compassion over assumption, this story is a reminder. The real value of a person is not in what they wear, what they drive, or where they come from. It's in how they carry themselves and how they treat others when no one important is watching. That is the message that matters, and it always will.